Well, good morning, everybody. In yesterday's report, we talked about the seriousness of the tornadoes that rolled through parts of Iowa, just how strong some of them were and some of the damage that we saw. I'd like to show you the Twitter feed from the Doppler on Wheels. So this is a part of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. That's my alma mater where I taught for 15 years. And so this is their public account. I'd just like to show you what they were able to capture. Now, if you've never seen this, I'll just slide down here quickly and show you a picture of the Doppler on Wheels. This was taken by meteorologist Jason Parkin. That's what we're talking about. So the radar's on the back, it's mobile, and they can place this very close to storms when we're doing storm research. But if we come back up to the top, I want you to take a look at the velocity couplet measured by the Doppler on Wheels as this particular tornado went through Greenfield, Iowa. And as we look at it here, what we're looking at is, again, called a velocity couplet. These colors represent flow that's going toward the radar, these going away. And what we can do with that phase shift that's measured by the Doppler radar is estimate a wind. And I want you to see over here that they are suggesting that there's the possibility in this very, very narrow tornado that there were winds approaching 290 miles an hour. And it's just amazing to be able to see this. And their estimate height of that is 44 feet above the ground. 44 meters above the ground, 144 feet above the ground in imperial units. So it's just an amazing thing to witness here, and I'm glad that the Doppler on Wheels is out fulfilling their purpose of being able to remotely sense these high-impact events. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to take you to some other radar data. Yesterday, we had storms that stretched from south-central Texas all the way to New York, and I want to focus in on one storm in particular just to kind of teach you a bit more about how to use radar data. A couple of things to take note of on this storm. This is a supercell thunderstorm, and I want to point out a couple of interesting features about it. Why don't we start on the south side of it? You see this fine line right here? That's a part of what we call the rear flank of the storm. That's called the rear flank downdraft. That's where the backside of the storm has descending air. It's hitting the ground and kicking up dust and debris and whatever else is in its way, and we can sample that with the radar. That's what you see here. Now the rear flank, let's stop this and get a closer look. Let's bring it right up to speed here. There we go. The rear flank of the storm wraps itself right into the main updraft, which is located here, which is also the same position as the hook echo. So there's a forward flank to the storm, a rear flank to the storm, and in the middle is the updraft. Now, just near the updraft, where the air is rising most violently, that's where the storm is capable of supporting hail. And that's where we typically find our hail core, right into this area. Now, in radar data, like I like to use from Radar Scope, the hail is easier to see because they make a very hard break at 60 dBz. And normally when we're getting up into the high 50s, low 60s, we're starting to sample hail with the radar. And so you can see that here. But what I'd like to show you, if I flip this over to velocity, and let's kind of bring that back up to, let's get it playing here again so we can load all the data. There we go. As you can see, watch it again there as I bring it forward, another one of those velocity couplets. And so what's going on here is that the winds here, measured by the radar, which is quite far away, are going toward the radar, and the winds there are going away. So what that means is we have flow here and here, and therefore we can get a sense of rotation. And of course, this particular storm did produce a tornado report. If we just get right back into my slides here, I want to show you a couple of things. I mentioned the storm stretched from kind of western New York all the way down to Texas, but they did extend up into parts of Ontario and Quebec as well. But since we talked about hail first, I thought I'd show you the hail data. We'll just kind of zoom in here on the last 24 hours of hail as measured by radar. And this was the storm we just analyzed. So you can see some of the hailstones it was producing were 2 to 3 inches in diameter. Absolutely massive. And if we look at the actual storm reports from yesterday, another 320 were added up, including 3 tornado reports. The one we were looking at was this one right here. That would be the report that we just examined. So this just continues to be an extremely active May. We'll look at the end of the month the total statistics, but we've been keeping track of those in these videos, just looking at how far above average we currently are. But I want to show you another aspect of this. This is what these storms look like on satellite. And as we kind of blow this forward, we were watching this guy right here. But I want you to see what was going on the back side of this. All of this is, again, outflow from these storms butting up against an entirely different air mass that's over the southwestern part of Texas. And in this is not only dust, but also wildfire smoke. And this just brings up a really important point about what's going on in Mexico. And I just want to show you this again. As we kind of play this forward, all of this that you see in through this area is wildfire smoke from Mexico. It's in the Bay of Campeche. It's been throughout Mexico several times over the last several weeks. And it's just an indication of how dry things are in Mexico right now that need to continue to be monitored as a major source of what this upcoming summer U.S. pattern could be. In particular, I'm concerned about what it might mean for early ridging, heat building into Texas that could set up the Central Plains, the Northern Plains, the Midwest, the Mid-South, and the Southeast into a very active severe thunderstorm season throughout June and July if that continues to build into place. So we're going to have to watch that carefully. I want to do one other thing. I didn't do this earlier, but let's go back here. I would like to see the Southwest very quickly here. Yes, I wanted to also bring up that we're continuing to monitor some rather large fires. This one right here in parts of Arizona for the last several days continuing to put out some smoke. So we're going to have to watch all of these things. Now, what's amazing is a year ago, I wasn't focused on the South or Mexico for wildfire smoke. It was all up in Canada. Going back to just late May last year, all of this was wildfire smoke. Remember, fires initially broke out in parts of Alberta and British Columbia. They were also here in parts of northern Manitoba. This is all wildfire smoke. And then later in May, we were getting wildfire smoke from the eastern side of Canada. And that lasted all the way until June, where I believe nearly 18.5 million hectares of land burned. But as it stands, let's go have a look at what's going on right now. So this is our newest satellite data. Early this morning, we can see all of those storms from yesterday, ripping off in this area. And I want to get you through the overnight hours and see the clusters of storms early this morning that were still moving into this region. Did you also notice the other piece to this? There's our next low we're going to watch. And that low is going to open up another corridor to some severe weather. Now, here's what we're going to be covering in the rest of this video. I've been very clear that despite models showing a pattern break, there was a strong failure mode in this. We need to see if that failure mode is coming into fruition. We're then going to look out there into the month of June is to see what we need to be paying close attention to as well. So let's kind of start to diagnose this together. Last 24 hours of total accumulated precipitation is shown here. And as we watch one system leave, and there's its lingering front, all right, this is the next system that's going to grab hold of what's here and pull it back into the plains. Now, this has been a part of an extremely active May, as you know, and I wanted to show you the May month-to-date precipitation statistics. And it just shows how wet we've been in the southeast, how wet we've been in parts of Tennessee, Kentucky, and of course, kind of the epicenter of recent severe weather, in addition to incredibly heavy rains in parts of Iowa and nearby surrounding states. Now, that is not to take away from what other parts of the plains and Midwest and Mid-South and Southeast have been experiencing. But this is something that is continued to be front of mind, just given that we now have 2 climate reporting districts in Iowa that are reporting their wettest Mays on record. We also have one down here in southern Georgia, just to take note of those areas. So we have this question as to whether or not this pattern is truly going to start to make some sort of a shift. And we watched Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I've made an argument that if it's going to shift, it'll show up here first, right? Remember we talked about that? It's going to show up in the North Pacific first. We want to know if that's still there. So let's get into what's going on today. At 6:20 this morning, about the time I'm recording this, we have flood watches out through this area. Continues to be a lot of flooding throughout our river systems here after the recent rains. Red flag warnings coming out of New Mexico, strong winds in southern Mexico. Coming off the downslope wind field here, we've got strong winds, and on the backside, winter storm warnings. A couple of areas of patchy frost, one in the Snake River Valley, one in southwestern Oregon, one in northwestern parts of California. But the pattern is still here. Let this reset for a second. The ridge we're talking about is this guy right here. See the flow coming up over the top? As that flow comes over the top like this, it just continues to send kind of the combination of the subtropical jet and the polar jet together to increase the flow across the United States. And with nothing impeding this flow, it's been unable to become blocked up, to slow down, to become more, as we talked about yesterday, highly amplified. Now, we've seen the models suggest amplification, big ridges, big troughs that slow the pattern down. And we're just going to question if that's still there in the current forecasts. So speaking of current forecasts, as the low that was over the northwest continues to move out, there's the front that lingers. This is the new pull on the moisture. And then later today, we've got kind of a bullseye here in the Storm Prediction Center enhanced outlook for parts of Nebraska, northern Kansas, getting into Iowa again. Now, throughout, surrounding this, we have a large area that is under the slight risk, and we will still watch storms in this area as well. But as we go from today into tomorrow, this would be the 24th, we're now seeing that kind of spread over into parts of Illinois and Indiana and stretching back down to this part of eastern Texas. I'm a little bummed about this. I'm hoping that we can push these off as long as I can. I'm taking my son, my dad, and my nephew over to Carb Day for the Indianapolis 500. I'm not going to go to the race this year. I had a schedule change. I love going to the Indy 500, but we're going to go over for Carb Day and kind of check out what's going on there. But then as we continue this forward, this would be on the 25th. Look at the reset right back down into the Southern Plains. Already have an enhanced risk out for that day. We'll take a close look at what's going to be causing that in just a few moments. And that's day 3. Don't forget about day 4. Now back over parts of the Mid-South where the Ohio and Mississippi come together. Already we have a 30% region out there where on Sunday we're getting concerned about the risk of these severe storms. So we got 4 more days of this as we go forward with this pattern. So let's get into the near-term look at this. As we play through the day today, you can see it. There's our front. Here's the new low. And as this all comes together this afternoon and this evening, we're going to watch building all the way up and down this line, connected to the frontal boundary, still stretched in through here. This is our greatest risk of storms, right in through this area. Heavy rains possibly to the north of this. This is this evening, getting into the overnight hours. We're going to watch for the potential for a nocturnal squall line event that could roll across the top of the boundary layer and continue to press through parts of Nebraska into Minnesota, Iowa, possibly into Missouri, coming out of Kansas as well. So as we play into early Friday morning, we watch that front just move across parts of Iowa very quickly, and then we get into Illinois. And again, we see this kind of interesting daytime event that kind of fizzles out. Could be because of the way the low moves farther to the north. Could just be the way that we've kind of run into a little bit of drier air in this area. But regardless, it runs out of the ability to keep the storms going until we get into the evening hours when it could possibly blow back into this area again. Now take note of what's going on the west. Even through Friday, we're still not done. We're still getting convection coming through the mountains. And you can see the flow as I rock it back and forth. Okay? There's still flow like this on Saturday morning through midday Saturday. We're going to have to watch the next system come out Saturday evening and followed on Sunday once again in an area right through here. Now, this pattern we've been talking about each day this week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I said we have to watch that ridge. If that ridge gets split, if it gets moved, if it gets displaced, it's going to change everything. And we watch the models try to do that, including the artificial intelligence. And I told you the failure mode is if it doesn't happen, if the models are too aggressive on this. So ready? Let's see where they are now. We're picking this up here today, later today, on the flow. So here are the shortwave troughs initiating the severe weather. That's the one tonight. Then as we get into the weekend, look at this next one sweeping through Saturday, Sunday. These are the troughs that are responsible for all the severe weather. They're just orbiting around this bigger trough feature. Now here we are, May 28th. We saw the models shift this ridge over, letting a trough dig in here, and I said, look, the pattern's getting a bit more amplified. And if it can stay that way and keep those troughs away from the west coast of the United States, we'll get into an entirely different feel in the month of June. So here we are now. This is May 28th, where we were watching for that pattern shift. 29th, 30th, and we may get a few drier days in here as this all takes shape. But this is what I don't like seeing. On May 31st to June 1st and June 2nd, all of a sudden, this ridge tries to flex its muscles north while the trough comes into parts of Alaska. And right in between, that is strong zonal flow. I mean, it is screaming in this area. And if you get strong zonal flow, not big meridional flow, north-south, it's going to push what is ever here. It's going to continue to push. So on June 2nd, June 3rd, June 4th, look at how this trough comes back into play. And now instead of having a larger ridge that lives in the midsection of the country, because I always thought we saw that highly amplified flow, it's flattened out a bit. The subtropical part of the jet stream is kicking off little weak waves down here. And as we move into that first week of June and beyond, we just continue to see lower heights to the south, the big trough to the west, and this little ridge is not enough to knock it out. And so this is the kind of the failure mode that was possible in this pattern. Because that ridge came back temporarily, it reinvigorated this trough, and that's what's going to get us into an active start to the month of June now. And some of the models have really trended toward this. And be honest, it's a very frustrating thing if you're a meteorologist to think you can make sense of a pattern shift to only see it kind of evaporate in the next few model runs. But we need to take a look at what all this means in terms of our precipitation pattern. Now, there's not been a change in the near-term forecast. We've known that the next 7 days to get us to the end of May was going to look like this. And here's your latest update from the Artificial Intelligence Forecasting System on total precip. Here's the national blend of models. No changes in this at all. This is the WPC outlook for the next 7 days, and this is the European. If we go from the European to the GFS, that's a 14-day. Let's go back to the 7-day. That's a 7-day outlook from the GFS. Now we put all this together and start looking at probabilities over the next 10 days. Here's your best chance at getting an inch of rain. And honestly, there's not been much change in this overall. We can see the same wet corridors showing up. But the only thing that's, I think, significant is that we're not seeing the high probabilities of extremely wet weather across the south, right here along the Gulf Coast into the southeast. This area needs a bit of a slowdown, given how wet things have been as of late, but we can't keep that slowdown around too long. You're always a week away from drought in this area. So given that we now see that the end of May and the start of June now has more of a persistence mode than a true break, that failure mode we talked about is finally there. We need to go in and have a look at it in the models and then look out there at week 2. So GFS left, European right, same kind of setup as we normally do. And as we play this forward, we've already watched through Friday and Saturday, and here comes our next pulse. This would be that Saturday night into Sunday morning risk of severe storms in this area. That's more wet weather through the weekend that rolls right through the Midwestern United States, builds up into a deep low that centers itself over the Great Lakes, Ontario, and Quebec, hits the Northeast with quite a bit of heavy rain. And then here is this time period around May 27th into the 28th, where we do get a slight break in the midsection of the country from all the wet weather. But right away, on the 30th, 31st, weak front starts to sneak through, connected to a low that's much farther to the north. And that's going to kind of come through and bring in some rainfall. And it is kind of in both models. The timing's a bit different. But here we are now getting toward the beginning of June. And instead of seeing just large ridges stopping the pattern, they are now flattening themselves out and the flow is continuing. And the question is how long? How long does this continue to last? We're going to get to that in a second. But first, I want to talk a bit about week 2 again and then the temperatures. So you remember yesterday, right? We were looking at the day 8 through 14. We saw the European was drier here. It was stormier down in the southern plains. And now you can see the European has opened up a corridor in its week 2 time frame of wetter conditions. Still keeps the southeast dry. That's also in the GFS, which does have a known too dry bias in the southeast. But the GFS is seeing this. The CPC is seeing this. And this shift as we look out there, it just shows us how predictability during this May. We talked about at the very beginning, right? We have to live week by week in May. The predictability in May has been terrible. For me particular. Now, if you have another meteorologist who's been nailing it, man, I tip my cap to those guys because this pattern's been frustrating with how easy the failure modes have been showing up. But if that meteorologist has got a lot of confidence right now, I'd love to know what they're drinking in the morning because this has been a pattern I cannot instill any confidence in because persistence has won the day too many times. So let's talk about those temperatures. This is our frost potential over the next 7 days. And again, if we're looking here throughout the western and northwestern plains, getting into the northern plains, a lot of this is going to be coming up with the temperatures this Saturday morning. So if you take note, Saturday morning, we've got some really chilly air that's going to be getting into North Dakota here. This extends into the Canadian prairie. But beyond that, watch what our high temperatures are doing. Starting today, getting into Friday and Saturday. So this again, heat. Look at the extensive heat down in the southern plains. Now, at some point, if this heat doesn't break, we're going to get a feedback where we're going to start to build ridging in this area. And if we start to build ridging in this area from all of this heat, this whole corridor over the top is going to continue to see a lot of thunderstorms once you get into June. That's a very typical June pattern to build heat into Texas and watch the storms roll around the northern edge of this. But we're not there yet. This is still May 25th. As we play forward, the 26th and 27th, that heat stays on. Cooler air comes in behind that system over the weekend. This is now getting into Tuesday and Wednesday. And this was the warm-up that we thought would stick around longer in the west. But already, can you see where the presence of that trough cooling things down is here in the northwest? we're seeing that. So you look out there, day 5 through 10, okay, that's the cooler air moving in, the warmth in place. So remember, this is when we thought the pattern was going to be able to stay something like this for more than just a few days. It's going to be there in that day 5 through 10 time period. But day 10 through 15, I just don't see it. I think there's a subtropical piece that comes in. I think the flow is still deep enough that we're going to knock some of this out. I mean, the GFS is saying bring on the warmth here, but watch this. The European model day 5 through 10, day 10 through 15, just doesn't do it. It's got a little different look to it. It's got more troughs in this area from that flow coming around, and that's what keeps things more active, I think. Now, I have avoided showing you the MJO for a while, and I think it's because we've spent so much time in null space here. It's not been a major factor, but there are some indications that it's going to start to move. And we have to think about this for multiple reasons. Because as we get into the month of June, the MJO's movement, these big convective waves that move across the equatorial Pacific, also the Indian Ocean, well, they can have a reflection in the Atlantic. And at some point, these big MJO moves start to give us these early season tropical setups in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, just speaking of that in HC, let's go have a look at something here. Oh, I don't want the GIS page. Sorry. That's where I was the other day. We do have right now in the Atlantic, 7-day outlook, they've got a 10% chance that this area of storms that's between Cuba and the island of Hispaniola could develop into some sort of area of low pressure. But I'm not talking about this. What I'm talking about here is a shift in the MJO initiating much better, lid removal, if you want to think of it that way, across the Atlantic, lowering the wind shear. So we need to be on the lookout for that in June, early named systems in June. But as it stands, I want to remind you that we're moving through phase 4 right now. And phase 4 supports that ridge we've been talking about and troughs downstream and even some slight southeast ridging, which keeps the flow going through the middle. And if we move into phase 5, this isn't really a slowdown. Can you see that? The ridge is still there. There's still weaker troughs coming to the northwest, and there's that heat that could possibly get into Texas, rolling these storms right over the top of this. And I didn't get a full chance to read their discussion on this, but I wonder if this is what the Climate Prediction Center was kind of hinting at. In fact, let's go look at it. Remember, their early June forecast was to stay wet here. Bring the heat out of Mexico and Texas up the west and just hit this area with some heat, with some storms. And we gave them full credit for this forecast, even though some of our longer range models were not necessarily in agreement. But I think that the bigger factors that we have influencing the pattern here is a combination of events. Any one of them alone is not strongly correlated with the pattern. I'm talking about the transition toward La Nina, the negative PMM, the negative PDO, and the warm water here. Any individual component seems to not have a strong correlation with the current pattern, but in combination, they must be able to do this. And I think a lot of it has to do with the temperature gradient here, and even the temperature gradient here helping to push the movement of the jet stream to dive into the western United States like it's been doing. That is the most critical thing I'm watching in the ocean temperatures right now. Later, it will be all the warmth that's here in the Atlantic with respect to the hurricane season. But I showed you the front half of June forecast that came out from the CPC. And remember, they put this out last Friday. They do this once a week on Friday. But as it stands, the European models kind of defaulted a bit to them. Looking at all of June, that corridor is looking stormy and wet. Watch the heat build into Texas, getting a ridge there, and the storms come over the top of this at times once we get into the beginning of June. That is a possible risk in this pattern as well. So what do we need to finish up with? I tell you what, let's go to agweather.com, my website. There it is. And I want to show you just a bit more on some international weather. I'm going to slide down here till we get to the precipitation. I just want to show you this. New 10-day forecast from the European. Still dry in this area. We've had some recent tropical activity already in the Indian Ocean. Very stormy and wet according to the models in this part of China, getting into Southeast Asia. We're watching for tropical activity here. Same stories going on in South America that we've been talking about now for several weeks with the wet conditions down into southern Brazil like Rio Grande do Sul. But now you can start to see a little bit wetter conditions getting into some of that safrinha crop. And it's cold coming up through Argentina right now. So with all of that kind of wrapped up here, That failure mode we talked about is starting to show up. We need to see if the trend is there, but any sort of a slowdown in this pattern, we may have to be waiting another 10 to 12 days, maybe even beyond that before we start to see it. And at that point, we get into a summer pattern and we deal with a whole new set of monsters when it comes to forecasting this weather. So I'm going to stop here, tell you I'll watch it all day and keep an eye on it and report back to you tomorrow. Appreciate it. Thank you.